Trigger warnings for incest, SA, CSA, abuse, child abuse, and suicide. Disclaimer. For this video, I'm using the recent Haru Diphthong retranslation of the anime. If the terminology and quotes don't match up with the Nozobi subs or whatever other subs you watched, and God forbid you watch the dub, that's why. I won't make note of translation apart from this. Just watch the Haru Diphthong subs, it's the best translation around. If you're going to be rewatching, definitely check out their translator notes on their Tumblr account as you do, but it's only for people who have already seen the series. And obviously enough, spoilers for Revolutionary Girl Utena, like the whole damn thing, including the movie. So if you're in the middle of the show, I recommend you finish it first. I already put you on the best translation anyhow. Mild spoilers also for Les Enfants Terribles by Jean Cocteau, Ada by Vladimir Nabokov, Flowers in the Attic by V.C. Andrews, and Forbidden by Tabitha Suzuma. Scuffed feature me here. I like to add mild spoiler warnings for the 2011 anime Mawaru Penguin, the 2004 anime Paranoia Agent, and the video game The Coffin of Andy and Lele. Really, I should have added one for Penguin and Paranoia Agent in the first place, since I always planned on using footage of them here. I would also like to add a mild gore warning, but it's nothing too crazy. Also, when I refer to the timeline of this video, I wrote the script in late 2025 and recorded it then. It took much longer to put the video together. Life's a bitch, as Age once said. The Terrible Involutions. The meaning of incest in Revolutionary Girl Utena. No one could foresee the moment when these two sundered portions of a single being would cease from strife and become one again. Jean Cocteau, Les Enfants Terribles. As lovers and siblings, she cried, we have a double chance of being together in eternity, in rarity. 4 pairs of eyes in paradise. Vladimir Nabokov, Ada or Ardor, A Family Chronicle. Introduction to Involution. 2 years ago, I bought all 3 Blu-rays of the Revolutionary Girl Utena anime. I went in absolutely blind beyond having seen a meme about how most Utena fans are communist. Well, I am communist, but that's not going to be the point of this video. I hadn't even looked up what the series was about. Trigs aren't a concern for me, but I always keep them in mind for others. So my first watch was an incredibly bizarre experience. I was already drawing connections between the Rose Red and Utena and the sacrifices of Yunkoka's Loveless, only to later find out that Ikuharu and Koga follow each other on Twitter. And by the end gained something of an understanding about the show's thesis on power, though I was still dazed and confused about what it all meant. And what weirded me out most, as it doubtless has done you, was the consistent theme of incest.
Koze?
2 years prior to watching Utena, I read for the first time the book that 3 years later would become my favorite of all time, Vladimir Nabokov's Ada. It's a novel about a lifelong incestuous relationship. It is also a novel about time, memory, and impermanence. As I watched Utena for the first time, I was already drawing many parallels between it and Ada, in spite of their many dissimilarities. Mainly, both stories embrace shifting settings, and the artificiality of stories to explore their themes in ways ordinary works in their respective mediums and genres can rarely do, and with a lot more flair to boot via mimicry and parody. A year passed after my first watch before I decided to rewatch it, and this time I decided to have some analysis by my side, especially for the Black Rose saga, because I really didn't understand what that was about my first time around. But even as I came to understand how Utena explores gender and patriarchy, time and memory, I still struggled with the incest aspect, especially when it came to Miki and Kozoe Kaoru. The only analysis that really helped me understand the Kaoru siblings was Snake Eye Dreams' video on Miki, which I think comes closest to fully grasping how Utena uses incest. I do highly recommend it and their introduction to Utena, since they're what got the ball rolling on my understanding of the show. I only dislike the way they bring up the incest in the Miki video, since it's a bit immature and also out of place given their insights and general demeanor. Most discussion I've come across in the show's incest has mainly focused on the Kiryu siblings along with Anthy and Akio. They mainly focus on gender and patriarchy, which is certainly accurate. But it seems everyone really struggles to understand the Kaoru twins, and they're often the twin black sheep of the show. I certainly thought so at first and wondered why they were included, since it seemed to muddy up an otherwise clear thesis on incest and abuse. First-time viewers, especially the ones not as accustomed to weird fiction, outright dismiss this show due to its use of incest. I want to take this analysis further than just gender and patriarchy, since those themes have gotten more than enough attention, at least on YouTube. I'm too lazy to read up on MC movement for now, maybe another day. A lot of people mainly focus on how the anime differs in its portrayal of incest compared to other anime and manga, but I want to take this outside the realm of anime and manga and into literature. My main goal here is to explain why I think Revolutionary Girl Utena uses incest to explore time, memory, mythology, and impermanence, in addition to gender and patriarchy. I want to explain how all of these are wound together. The key word here is involution. This is mainly intended for new viewers who might be scratching their head at the inclusion of incest after a first watch. But I also hope fans, and especially longtime fans, still get something out of this as well. At the very least, you'll have a video to link to your normal friends who don't tolerate the weird as much as we do, and might simply dismiss something as problematic without really engaging with it further. In general, I'm not going to focus on good or bad, or simply go off the ick factor, as y'all have probably been able to guess from how I opened this video. Ikuhara himself has said he doesn't go for moralism or good judgment. I'll just quote my favorite author to explain my approach. Let me submit the following practical suggestion. Literature, real literature, must not be gulped down like some potion which may be good for the heart or good for the brain. The brain, that stomach of the soul. Literature must be taken and broken to bits, pulled apart, squashed. Then its lovely reek will be smelt in the hollow of the palm. It will be munched and rolled upon the tongue with relish. Then, only then, its rare flavor will be appreciated at its true worth, and the broken and crushed parts will again come together in your mind and disclose the beauty of a unity to which you have contributed something of your own blood. Vladimir Nabokov on Fyodor Dostoevsky. Part 1 of Princedom by the Sea. Insularity. I think about those elements of Japanese gardening Frederick is opposed to, aspects so loved by the Japanese, the techniques of controlling nature, perfected over 1,000 years. Was it because they lived in lands so regularly rocked by earthquakes and natural calamities that they sought to tame the world around them? Tan Tuan Eng, The Garden of Evening Mists. RGU is perhaps one of the most bizarre buildings roaming out there. Not that I'm very familiar with that strain of fiction. The main theme I've noticed about incest across Revolutionary Girl Utena, the aforementioned Ada, Lust of Uncerebrus by Jin Cocteau, Flowers in the Attic by V.C. Andrews, and Forbidden by Tabitha Suzuma, is how they all use it as a way of establishing what I call hermetism, note, not hermeticism, or insularity, which is usually just called isolation, especially in the cases of gothic fiction, but I'm using a more specific word. In the case of RGU, I see this as a component of involution. The word involution has a couple of meanings, but I'll generally define it here as drawing inwards and shrinking, regressing into itself, complicated and convoluting itself all the while. Hermetism and insularity I'll here define as being locked within an exclusive world, usually by one's own volition. In Les Enfants Terribles, you have two siblings, Paul and Elizabeth, who isolate themselves from the world as they play what they call the game as a war is waged. Their ill mother dies and they are essentially left to themselves in their small living quarters with the minimal support of doctors until they grow older. People come into their lives who disrupt their dynamic throughout their adolescence. The siblings here aren't outright in love with each other, but their relationship certainly isn't normal, especially on Elizabeth's part in her treatment of Paul, her younger brother. However, this isn't just treated as merely some trauma response in the book, as a modern author might try to write it so as to make their story more palatable and approachable. Although Cocteau very clearly had a number of issues that got reflected in his works. The siblings essentially used the game to override reality, and the narration constantly refers to the genius they possess. For it was indubitably a masterpiece these children were creating. A masterpiece devoid of intellectual content, devoid, this was the miracle, of any worldly aim. The masterpiece of their own being. In Flowers in the Attic, the children of the doppelganger family are locked in an attic so their mother can earn their father's inheritance following a family tragedy. The children make do with their imprisonment as a horrible grandmother acts as a dragon witch, and as their mother's love wanes. The two older siblings, Chris and Catherine, who is also the narrator, take care of their baby twin siblings, Corey and Carrie. Repeatedly throughout the book, the doppelgangers, and especially Chris and Kathy, dream up the lives they wish to lead after they gain the inheritance. Eventually, the children make a papier-mâché garden which they model off their collective memory of the outside world as a way to cope with their enclosure. In Forbidden by Tabitha Suzumo, Lo-chan and Maya Whitley are brother and sister whose dad left. In the wake of their father parting from them, these two pick up the slack on their alcoholic mother's negligence to take care of their younger siblings. Lo-chan and Maya are unable to lead normal lives, especially as poor children. They're parentified to the point that their relationship aberrates into something not very sibling-like. And much like Cocteau's terrible siblings, the doppelgangers, they imagine a better life for themselves as they head to perdition. In the cases of these three books in RGU, you have siblings living out of bounds or in the margins, usually due to poverty or the threat thereof, especially in the case of the Whitley siblings along with Paul and Elizabeth. The incest acts as a way of creating a closed-in world, such as Otori Academy, which somehow lies somewhere, someone outside the normal stream of human time and space, as do the siblings. Ada is a very strange book, and its use of incest is even more shocking than these other examples. It differs greatly from these books in this anime, but in some ways it's closer to RGU. As I mentioned earlier, it's a novel about a lifelong incestuous relationship, except there's no pretext of poverty or parentification. Ada and Von Veen are basically aristocrats in a bizarre planet called Antiterra or Demonia, which parallels Earth in many ways, but is also incredibly different, from North America having been taken over by Russia to electricity having been banned in favor of using water as a power source for cars and phones and so much more. Like RGU, the whole setting is a real stage-like anachronistic phantasmagoria. Ada and Vaughn create their insularity and hermetism by playing their own games, usually at the exclusion and expense of others, since they see themselves as above the rest of the populace. RGU aligns itself more with the other books mentioned here with its use of incest and relationships, specifically more so Les Enfants Terribles given how absent parental figures are in the series, and with the way a game is projected onto the world. Utena themselves is notable for the fact that they're an orphan and an only child, with their only childness being a part of their foil to Judy. Due to the absence of proper parental figures, the very nature of Otori Academy and Akio's machinations, what you have is children living outside of what would be normal who were then arrested in development. This is most prominent with Akaori twins. In physiology, involution also refers to the shrinkage of organs to former sizes due to old age or inactivity, such as the uterus after childbirth. Wiktionary also provides this definition: the migration of a cell layer inward, sliding over an outer layer of cells. It occurs at gastrulation during embryogenesis. Except since no one can grow old, you have these characters stuck in the past. From Akio's pursuit to embody the ideal of Prince Dios, to the Sunlit Garden, to Professor Nemoto becoming a mnemonic phantom known as Sojin Mikage. What you have is a lot of empty movement where people spiral ever onwards to nothing in a closed-off world. Another definition of involution, also provided by Wiktionary, is entanglement, a spiraling inwards, intricacy. What you have with the incest and RGU is these siblings drawing inwards to the family for a sense of eternity, of everlasting love. Ikuhara makes this clear in his commentary for episode 15 as provided by a DVD release. The reason sexuality is so often expressed in brother-sister relationships in the world of fiction is probably because there's the illusion that blood relationships are eternal. It's the dream of the eternal lover. But I'll also quote myself from a post I made a few weeks ago after my first RGU watch, although I find the post a bit cringy now. In a sense, a sibling is the safest choice of a prince. Unlike the other bonds in life, you don't have to forge it. The set dressing is already there for you. There's a pre-established connection, especially if you're like Kazuo and Mickey. It's an almost primeval love, a love one can stay in if they so choose, but like the chick that will only suffocate and die within its shell like the ageless members of Otori. This is at least from the point of view of someone like Nanami, and I said that as someone who was once similar to her. And so the hermetism of Otori Academy is reflected not only in the freezing of time, the pursuit of eternity, the closed-inness of the school, the cultishness of the Mikage Seminarium, which itself is an inner splinter of Otori Academy, but also the incest. You see sliding degrees of hermetic incest scaling from Nakaoru twins to the Kiryu siblings to, eventually, the zenith of incest between Akio and Anthy. Incestuous relationships in fiction, or at least in these stories, create a sense of intense privacy and secrecy for the people involved. In all these stories, this sense of insularity is also tied into how the characters interact with the world. In the most ordinary story in this selection, Forbidden by Tabitha Suzuma, this is most clearly demonstrated in the forbidden love angle. A lot of the interaction with the world means creating their own world for themselves. Additionally, one of the consequences of being cut off from the main world this way, as is shown in Forbidden and Flowers in the Attic, is the emergence of role confusion, usually through parentification as discussed before. Part of the entanglement is the inappropriate positions the siblings fill in.
私にはわかりません。
お前は彼女のことをどんな風に思ってるんだい？
どんなって。
彼女のことをどう思ってる？言ってごらん。
ティーカップ割れちゃった。
明夫さん、いませんか？
ああ、こっちだよ。なんだい？
別に用があるわけじゃないんですけど。あれ、なんか兄弟水入らずのとこお邪魔しちゃったかな。
邪魔だなんて。僕たち3人はもう家族みたいなものじゃないか。何も遠慮はいらないからね。
家族みたいなものか。
すいません。何かお兄様が押し付けがましいこと言っちゃって。
うん、そんなことないよ。僕は家族がいないから嬉しかったよ。本当だよ。明夫さんってなんていうか包容力があるよね。
お兄様は、そうですね。確かに大人かもしれません。私の親代わりですから。
親か。
In all these stories save for Ada, the precarity into which these siblings are thrown malforms their bond and incites the incest. In the case of Anthy and Akio, this puts Akio more literally in the role of the patriarch. Parents are worryingly absent on Otori. Ordinarily, this would just be a magical boarding school, but the anime only plays into that during the Student Council saga, before the series does its tone shift with the Black Rose saga. At most, you might get a few scenes filled with worried parents before the children depart before the darkest hour. But the absence of the parents is just a backdrop for the escapist adventure for the most part. Akio, however, takes advantage of the absence of parents in the academy he's tasked to run. With how he's frozen time around children cut off from the rest of the world, he creates the conditions for incest to transpire, at least as it's written in fiction. In the books mentioned here, there are no large age gaps between the siblings, and in the case of Paul and Elizabeth, they don't realize the oddity of how they interact with each other at first when they're younger. In much the same way Nanami doesn't understand the scope of her worship for her brother until she sees the truth of Akio and Anthy's relationship. The Kaoru twins seem to be in the middle ground regarding this. How well they understand the gravitas of their malformed relationship, I can't say. But given RJU's connections between death and life to adolescence and burgeoning sexuality, I think this quote from Les Enfants Terribles fits perfectly. A child's reaction to this type of calamity is twofold and extreme, not knowing how deeply, powerfully life drops anchor into his vast sources of recuperation. He is bound to envisage, at once, the very worst. Yet at the same time, because of his inability to imagine death, the worst remains totally unreal to him. Especially considering how real-life cases of this can happen between people at such young ages that they don't recognize what they're doing to each other. They might move on and never bring it up again, as if it never happened. They might feel odd yet not traumatized. It's just something in a dark corner gathering dust, or so they hope. I think that's the position that Kaorus occupy, except they're going through adolescence, which means the darkness will come to light one way or another. Of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that the Coda twins didn't swing so close to the edge of incest until Mikage's interference, with his interference entombing them further into their deformed hang-ups. This is specifically visually communicated by and associated with the dark watery depths and coffins. While Nanami had that veneration of Toga for nearly the entire series, and Toga himself put up a resistance to her cloying fixation, it isn't until much later after meeting Akio and being taken to the end of the world that he ever tries to return the attention. But by then, Nanami had come to understand what her feelings really led to, especially considering how the Gyuris have a more disparate age gap like Akio and Anthy than the Coda twins. In summary, incest is used to create a sense of closed-offness, exclusivity, and insularity caused by some form of alienation. This aspect of incest is reflected in RGU through the setting of Otori Academy, which exists in its own alien flow of time and space, in much the same way an incestuous couple would live separately and secretly from the rest of the world. Additionally, in all these stories about incest, you see siblings struggling to separate due to the appearance and interference of a new person, or, more accurately and generally, the outside world. This outside force threatens their insularity. Along with the interference from without comes the changes from within, that being adolescence. Since these siblings are in situations where they don't have proper parental figures, they don't quite have someone mature to model themselves off of and later spring out of when it comes to how to handle other relationships. This is made worse in cases of forced proximity. Instead, they have only or primarily each other, which leads to role confusion, especially at the onset of puberty. As a last note about the insularity and hermetism of involution, the effects of incest, especially towards a younger family member, means being removed from a healthy, natural relationship. Trauma in general twists you and leaves you feeling isolated from the rest of the world. It might even blind you to yourself. I hope this doesn't sound super basic or rote. I'm just trying to start us off on terra firma before we head off to terra incognita. Part 2. A Monument to Dead Ideas. Mythology. In their archaic unawareness, their play became the legend of eternal youth. Without their knowing it, the play, the room, swung on the edge of myth. Jean Cocteau, Les Enfants Terribles. Involution has a mathematical definition as well. A function, transformation, or operator that is equal to its inverse, i.e. which gives identity when applied to itself. I'll quote Brian Boyd here from his segment on Ada in Vladimir Nabokov, The American Years. The similarity of the children's remarks proves the singularity of their mental kinship, but to us, the similarity can only seem an unattractive basis for the children's love. Vaughn and Ada feel so attracted to each other precisely because they were so unnaturally alike. Each has found a duplicate self to worship. Passionate love for someone else proves unpleasantly close to ardent self-love, as if Narcissus were to find that the adoring echo and the reflection he yearns for are one.
お前の傷も苦しみもいつも好みに感じている。
あなたは世界のすべてを知った上でこの道を選んだ方です。
俺はお前をすべて知った上で愛している。
はい、お兄様。
安心、剣を。
In the Symposium, Plato has Aristophanes recount part of the ancient Greek creation myth. Here I'll quote from Haruki Murakami's Kafka on the Shore, as translated by Philip Gabriel. In ancient times, people weren't just male or female, but one of three types: male/male, male/female, or female/female. In other words, each person was made out of the components of two people. Everyone was happy with this arrangement and never really gave it much thought. But then God took a knife and cut everybody in half, right down the middle. So after that, the world was divided just into male and female, the upshot being that people spend their time running around trying to locate their missing other half. Snake Eye Dreams discusses how Miki and Kozue really are like incomplete fragments of one person, specifically with how Kozue takes what she wants while Miki isn't as forceful. Kozue has embraced sexuality, although she doesn't recognize the context in which her sexuality and sexual activity exist, while Miki recoils from it, especially from his sister's indirect provocations for his attention. This aspect of incest isn't quite as pronounced with Nanami and Toga beyond its general appearance in romance. My other half, my twin flame. Since a sibling can be seen as a ready-made soulmate/partner, the idea of being two parts of a whole design is heightened in the cases of incest. You see this more blatantly with Akio and Anthy. They're not exactly human, although Anthy knows every human pain. Akio is implied to be Prince Dios, but they're also depicted as separate entities. Anthe and Akio both hold on to the mythic memory of the former Prince Dios, even though the passage of time through countless revolutions has altered the both of them, and especially Akio. But unlike the Giryu siblings, they look alike, even if they're not spitting and splitting images of one another like the Coda twins. In the Black Rose saga, Anthe morphs into Mamiya Cheetah, adding on to both her resemblance to Akio and to the divinity/godhoodness that the two seem to possess. To explain their godhoodness and tie us all in together with the idea of a divine design, let's take a few examples of incest in mythology. In Japanese mythology, as the Kojiki recounts, Izanagi and his sister wife, Izanami, the 8th pair of brother-sister deities, at the order of the gods of heaven, stirred with their bejeweled spear the primordial cosmos as they stood on the bridge between heaven and earth. From the brine emerged the archipelago of Japan, which he would make into a home alongside Izanami. Here I quote the retelling of the creation myth from Nippon.com. Here they built a great pillar in a huge palace. Then Izanagi asked his sister Izanami, "What's your body like?" "It's lacking in one place," she replied. "My body is excessive in one place," he said. "I like to put that part into where you're lacking, to give birth to the land. What do you think?" "That would be good," she said. "Then let us circle around this pillar and have intercourse wherever you meet." Afterwards, they procreated and birthed several gods until Kakatsuchi, the fire deity, burned off Izanami's genitals, causing her to die in the process and inciting Izanagi's ketsubases to Yomi after her spirit descended to it following his burial of her corpse. There, he would rendezvous with the now rotting, maggot-infested Izanami covered in 8 thunder gods. He looked at her in spite of her orders not to, and horrified by her new appearance, Izanagi, perhaps in what we can deem in the fashion of an inverted Orpheus, turned his back on her. As a result, Izanami ensured the deaths of 1,000 humans, and in retaliation, Izanagi ensured the creation of 1,500 humans. To switch to Roman mythology, I'll just read off this footnote by Brian Boyd to the family tree of Ada in his exhaustively annotated online edition of the novel. For context, the novel, in mimicry and parody of erotica, romance novels, and family chronicles, opens with a family tree. The family tree shows the names Zemsky and Demnosiny at the top, which eventually lead to Van and Ada Veen. And as Boyd explains, first, Russian Zemsky, earthly, derives from the root Zem, earth, land, as in Zemlya, earth, land, Zemsky, Zemnoi, earthly, and Temnosiny, dark blue, is not the traditional epithet for the sky, but a common enough accompaniment to more, sea, or okean, ocean, in their less sunny moods. In this sense, the Veen family tree evokes old cosmogonies, as if the Veens represented a whole world, as in some sense they do. Specifically, the beginning of the family tree with the Zemsky and the Temnosiny evokes the myth of Terra and Colis, earth and sky, most pertinently summarized in the following excerpt from the novel Pierre or the Ambiguities, 1852, by Herman Melville, which Nabokov alludes to in Lolita, and which plays with the shadow of brother-sister incest between the American aristocrat Pierre Glendinning and his illegitimate half-sister Isabelle Banford. In a dream vision, Pierre sees an outcrop on his old family lands as representing Enceladus the Titan, the most potent of all the giants, rising from out the imprisoning earth, that deathless son of Terra. Then ruminates on the fable. Old Titan self was the son of incestuous Colis and Terra, the son of incestuous heaven and earth. And Titan married his mother Terra, another and a cumulatively incestuous match, and thereof Enceladus was one issue. So, Enceladus was both the son and grandson of an incest, and even thus, there had been born from the organic blended heavenliness and earthiness of Pierre another mixed, uncertain heaven-aspiring, but still not wholly earth-emancipated mood. I would also say there was an implicit incest in the story of Adam and Eve, or maybe you could even call it self-cest, given that Eve was made from Adam's rib. I know I'm not the only one who thought the two stood in the shadow of brother-sister incest, given they were the first 2 humans ever and were the ones to populate the earth. A quick Google search on whether or not Adam and Eve were incestuous landed me this article from Bible.org, posted January 1st, 2001, which says, "As to incest, it was not considered a sin and was not prohibited for Adam and early man. If the race was to populate and fulfill the command of Genesis 1:28, there is little doubt that Adam's sons and daughters had to have married their own sisters and brothers if the race was to populate the earth. But due to the purity of the race, as evidenced also by the long length of life, there were no adverse effects as we see happening today. Gradually, as the effects of sin took its toll on the human race, marrying one's own sister, etc., began to create hereditary problems." In these cases, incest is voluntary or expected, or at the very least accepted among higher beings since they exist outside the bounds of human norms in the human realm. In these three examples, incest is integral to the creation of the world, to the proliferation of the world, to the revolutions of the world. Otherwise, the taboo around incest is one of the very few most universal things in societies around the world, given how different cultures can be in their notions and norms. To tell us into how I started this segment, I quote from Paradise Lost by John Milton, probably the most overrated classic I've read. I now see bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh, myself before me. Woman is her name, of man extracted. For this cause he shall forego father and mother, and to his wife adhere, and they shall be one flesh, one heart, one soul. But of course, God and man condescend woman, as we all know. An aspect of Paradise Lost I don't often see get discussed is the way Eve is characterized as intellectually inferior to Adam. From this in the original story in the book of Genesis, we get an ad hoc explanation for the treatment of women. This is a component of gender, or more accurately, gender essentialism. In religions, this is specifically called complementarianism, the idea that man and woman were made to fit together like a puzzle, and their personalities likewise complement each other. This is that men are from Mars, women are from Venus bullshit. Even in these societies and cultures, however, what's deemed masculine and feminine varies from time to time and place to place, although the complementarianism remains as a way to oppress women under the patriarchy, while mythologizing them as somehow special and eternal to explain away their lot in life. As Edith Hamilton writes in the introduction of her mythology, according to the most modern idea, a real myth has nothing to do with religion. It is an explanation of something in nature. How, for instance, any and everything in the universe came into existence. Men, animals, this or that tree or flower, the sun, the moon, the stars, storms, eruptions, earthquakes, all that is and all that happens. Thunder and lightning are caused when Zeus hurls his thunderbolts. A volcano erupts because a terrible creature is imprisoned in the mountain and every now and then struggles to get free. The Dipper, the constellation called also the Great Bear, does not set below the horizon because a goddess once was angry at it and decreed that it should never sink into the sea. Myths are early science, the result of men's first trying to explain what they saw around them. However, myths, religion, and fiction don't exist in a vacuum. As Marx writes in The German Ideology, the ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas, i.e. the class which is the ruling material force of society is at the same time its ruling intellectual force. The class which has the means of material production at its disposal has control at the same time over the means of mental production, so that thereby, generally speaking, the ideas of those who lack the means of mental production are subject to it. The ruling ideas are nothing more than the ideal expression of the dominant material relationships. The dominant material relationships grasped as ideas. The individuals composing the ruling class possess among other things consciousness, and therefore think. For instance, in an age and in a country where royal power, aristocracy, and bourgeoisie are contending for mastery and where, therefore, mastery is shared, the doctrine of the separation of powers proves to be the dominant idea and is expressed as an eternal law. In the case of RGU, you have Akio as the acting chairman of Otori Academy. The specter of Prince Dios to which he aspires is an image and idea that existed long before him. This is why the true relationship between the two is ambiguous. After all, there is no Dios Otori or Dios Himamiya, only Prince Dios. It's notable that in spite of the ubiquity of the idea and image of the prince, no one in the show recognizes Akio as Prince Dios in spite of their likeness, and yet the strong resemblance in the prince's role as the ideal of the male gender, and thus gender relations, along with Akio's position in the Torii, makes it clear he's shaping Prince Dios in people's minds through it, all the while he tries to reshape himself back to Prince Dios in his search for lost time. Everyone in the show attempts to embody the model of the prince and the princess. This in spite of the fact Prince Dios reveals he couldn't save his sister due to the incest that would be involved. But time, and Anthy's attempt to save him from the commanding moths which resulted in her being the thousandfold impaled scapegoat, greatly changed him in the collective memory of the prince. And the shared mythology and collective memory of the prince, as shown in the Shadow Girls play The Tale of the Rose, distorts the truth and makes no mention of Akio's abuse of Anthy, and casts Anthy as the one at fault. To tie this back to the Marx passage, in real life, the Kojiki would prove foundational for Shinto in Japan due to it being a state-concerted effort to realize a Japanese identity in the wake of more foreign influence. Specifically, the compiling of the Kojiki was a way to establish and correct genealogies and mythologies, and to justify and consolidate imperial and noble power, along with establishing the Yamato clan in particular, who now formed the overwhelming majority of Japan. Part of this was also the belief that the emperor and imperial family were descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu. I'm not going to pretend to understand Japanese history or mythology or the Kojiki, but I did find an interesting little thing on JSTOR. It's a chapter titled Incest and Rebirth in the Kojiki by Fuminobu Murakami in volume 43 of the academic journal Monumenta Nipponica. As the chapter title suggests, it goes over how incest works in the Kojiki, specifically on the very confusing relationship between Izanagi and Izanami with Amaterasu and Susanoo, which I also won't pretend to fully understand at all, but I'll quote this passage since it aligns with what I need for this essay. It is possible to suggest that the brother-sister union was believed to strengthen and purify the rebirth of the grandparents' souls in the grandchildren's bodies. A brother-sister union guaranteed the preservation of the parents' blood in the children's bodies. In short, Izanagi and Izanami, like Amaterasu and Susanoo, committed incest to allow their parents' souls to be reborn in their children. Izanagi and Izanami were necessary to reproduce Amaterasu, the ancestor of the imperial family. As we keep seeing, incest, and especially brother-sister incest, is strangely integral to these creation myths. In general, you see here how higher beings are given leeway from human norms, and people in power are the ones codifying these tales and nesting themselves in divinity. While there is clearly sexual tension between the Coda twins, both seem to fail to understand how heavy the undertones are, in much the same way children their age will fail to grasp the finality of death in spite of being aware of it intellectually. Nanami, being younger and more naive, worships her brother, but, as stated before, we later see her confront the reality of where her feelings lead to. Toga clearly understands before her given his age and the general theme of him being ahead of his peers, which is probably why Akio prevents him first out of the student council and shows him the end of the world in the Apocalypse saga before anyone else. All of this is why it's very notable that Akio and Anthe, the twin of Prince Dios and an everlasting princess who are coded as demigods, are the ones who have fully driven out of the world's edge into outright incest. Akio and Anthe are intimately interwoven into the fabric of the hermetic world of Otori Academy. In the show, we see this with Akio's deployment of Anthe to transubstantiate into Mamiya, and how she seems to be tapped into the obscure complexes and insecurities of people, such as when she suddenly starts playing the Sunlit Garden, or hands over that rose to Judy. We see this more clearly in the movie where Akio has been dead for some time and Anthe has been playing Prince to a degree, as the populace sustains the collective memory of the Prince. We see that reflected in the shifting, structureless architecture to communicate a sense of order-disorder barely being held together, along with the Mirage Sky Castle having been taken down to Earth on wheels to be later disappeared. In a way, Akio and Anthe are still working as one. I know this is a lot, and I myself have a hard time keeping up with all this, but I'll try to summarize here. RJU is playing with the two types of incest that exist in stories. I'll call them the divine incest and the human incest. The divine incest, as I've laid out, would mainly be Akio's charge, although it's notable that Prince Dios was not willing to commit incest to save Anthe. When and how Akio became himself and separate from Prince Dios, we don't know. All we know is that the two are distinct in the same way yourself when you were 14 and yourself when you're 40 are completely different people. Or maybe they're connected in the same way the Emperor of Japan was said to be a descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu. The main difference between Prince Dios and Akio is Akio's willingness to commit incest. One could read this as a second fall from grace, and a fall from divinity in an ironic twist of fate. His attempt to save her, to preserve this flower, ended in ruin.
あの人は花が散るのを見たくないんですよ。こうすれば短い命の花も少しは長持ちさせることができる。でもこうまでして長らいても花自身は嬉しいんでしょうか。永遠なんてこの世にはありませんよね。ただ永遠に憧れる心が美しく思えたりするだけだ。
Anthe is a human incest, the incest born from close and forced proximity and precarity. While she proclaims she sealed away the prince in episode 34, we don't see her do anything supernatural, meaning it's possible she gained her powers after she and Akio were banished and settled in Otori. Like the Kaoru twins, the Doppelgangers, and Cocteau's terrible children, Akio and Anthy spend much of their time in one room, drawing them closer to this human incest. Meanwhile, the incestuous aspect is whitewashed in the popular imagination as shown in the Shadow Girl stage play The Tale of the Rose. It is Anthy who mainly suffers the human consequences of incest. To quote Cocteau again, "Suicide is a mortal sin." I think that's why Ikuhara refers to her as the embodiment of reality. In turn, Akio is the embodiment of illusions and delusions. With both these siblings now living out of bounds, they create their own world, though more than likely not in a literal sense, and have only each other to rely on. Even with the other students and staff, they are fundamentally different and alienated from everyone due to their strange divinity in this dream world. Akio slowly morphs into something else. In the process, Anthy is likewise altered as their prison-pent relationship malforms in this amaranthine rose garden as they mature. When and how the incest began, we don't quite know, but given everything I've laid out here, you could assume it's integral to the existence and functioning of Otori. Additionally, one could say Dios became Akio when he committed the incest, which would again tie in with the theme of fallen stars. As a result, both Anthy and Akio change as they cling onto the past and try to embody dead roles. Part 3. In Search of Lost Time. The shared past is precious, not for itself, but because it is the basis of consciousness, of knowing, of being. Cedric J. Robinson, Black Marxism, the making of the Black Radical Tradition. Throughout RGU, shadowed people are used to communicate phantasmagoria. You can think of them as shorthands for actual events and people. However, these shadows also double as a way to communicate the fallibility of memory and tie into self-mythology, Ikuhara's general theme of the stories we tell ourselves. The show immediately opens with the mythic retelling of Utena's encounter with the prince, with the bodies of both Utena and the prince being blotted out in shadow. Additionally, the shadows are projected onto a background, as if the two were on a stage, and the person narrating this retelling is one of the shadow girls we see throughout the show. Side note, the Shadow Girls aren't exactly the muses of Greek mythology. It's entirely possible the muses were an influence, but the Shadow Girls are a reference to Kuroko, or Kurogo, who are basically stagehands in kabuki. The Shadow Girls are specifically the Kuroko of the theater troupe's Tenjo Sajiki, who had the Kuroko do more than set the stage, such as interact with the audience or break the fourth wall. I'll throw up this Tumblr post on screen for y'all to read, but I figured I should take this moment to bring this up, highlight a note by Shuji Terayama, the dramatist of the group and one of Ikuhara's inspirations, which says the Shadow Girls are totally responsible for fabricating lies. I don't know anything about Tenjo Sajiki, but given this, it's no surprise that shadow people are used to represent half-truths if not outright lies throughout the show, such as Nanami's delusions and later on the Tale of the Rose. When we're shown the mythic opening monologue in the beginning and throughout the show, we have no notion of these shadow people and their link to faulty memory and self-mythology at first. And as people not in the know about the avant-garde Angura, underground, scene of Japanese theater throughout the 60s and 70s, especially as foreign viewers, we did not suspect this is part of RGU's mimicry and parody of stories and storytelling by being as anarchic, mythological, and psychosexual as Angura. There was a brief instance in episode 1 where Utena thinks of the prince, and the prince is shown specifically blotted out in shadow. When the prince later appears in episode 2, we're shown his complexion when he descends from the Mirage Sky Castle, as an anticipation of Akio. It's not until the Sunlit Garden episodes that we finally get another instance of shadow people as the visual representation of what I call rememoration. Rememoration is simply an archaic form of remembrance, but I'll provide my own definition since this is how I've begun to use it in my personal writings. I define this word as the effort of remembering something, often in an inaccurate way, usually due to it being colored by future events, or even deliberate alteration. You can think of it as the way physiologists use dyes in order to highlight the structures of tissue samples. There is some corruption due to this process, but it isn't necessary in order for proper study and diagnosis to be done. Memories are fallible no matter what. If you've ever read a biography about a figure who also wrote an autobiography or memoir, you'll remember passages detailing what the subject of the biography left out in their own writings, or what they even distorted or simply misremembered. Sometimes you might find people who are very susceptible to self-mythology. You'll inevitably run into people remembering an event they were all at completely differently. Misremembrance is inevitable. Even seconds after something transpires, memory begins to distort and warp. And on top of all this, our memories are our recollections, thus they are the stories we tell ourselves. You can see this as tying into solipsism, but I wasn't really able to dive into that in this essay. which is why it's interesting that the use of shadow people being as in earnest with the Sunlit Garden episodes. In these episodes, the show establishes the intertwinement of time, memory, mythology, self-mythology, the garden motif, adolescence, and, most importantly for this video, incest. In episode 4, when Mickey explains to Nanami about the piano piece named The Sunlit Garden and how he wishes for it to reach a certain someone, Nanami is flustered by the young man's wistful romanticism, until her face spoils when she sees he means Anthe. However, as is later revealed, Mickey has simply displaced his fixation on Kozoe onto Anthe, which is visually communicated in how he rememorates Kozoe at that point in the past with hair that more so resembles Anthe's, whereas Kozoe doesn't remember herself that way at all in the brief instance we see of her recollection. Mickey constantly mulls over the lost garden he and his sister shared. Kozoe was never good at playing the piano, with Kozoe herself revealing that the tragic concert Mickey speaks about was just a recital.
あんたさ、本当に昔ピアノやってたの？私でももう少しは上手いわよ。
ま、才能はなかったわね。興味もなかったけど。
じゃあなんでやってたのよ。
隣に住んでた男の子がさ、昔よくラブレターくれたんだよね。あなたのピアノが好きですって。
へえ。
その子勘違いしてたのよね。私がピアノを弾けるって。弾くときはいつも兄貴と一緒に弾いてたからさ。小さい時はよく間違えられたわ。私までピアノが上手いって。兄貴は天才だからさ、私がデタラメに弾いてもちゃんとフォローしてくれるんだよね。でもコンサートっていうか発表会の時、兄貴が熱出して寝込んじゃったから全ておじゃんよ。
As a human being, her memory is still in question, but the show makes it clear that Mickey is the one distorting the past here. Recall again how in part 2 of this video I cited the mathematical definition of involution and provided Haruki Murakami's explanation of how humans were split by the gods in ancient Greek belief. The names Mickey and Kozoe mean tree trunk and tree top respectively. All the great playing that the two did was Mickey's work. But Mickey denies himself this to preserve an illusion of he and Kozoe acting as one being in their childhood musical kinship. The idea that Kozoe may have put up an act simply to spend time with him disturbs him because it would ruin his pure image of her and thus of their bond. They would instead be ordinary people rather than this romantic and mythic ideal. In this case, no gods were involved in these two splitting. Instead, Mickey concocts his self-mythology wholesale. The split these two experience represents the birth of their respective consciousnesses, and the mythology about the sunlit garden represents a desire to regress to a lesser state of consciousness. Now, Mickey is aware of himself and of Kozoe as separate beings, of Kozoe as a person with flaws and independence, and it terrifies him. His infatuation with Anthe has much to do with how obedient and non-assertive she is, which is demonstrated in his strange comparisons of her and Kozoe and their femininity. So, instead of seeing Kozoe as her own person, he instead mourns the loss of a mythic Kozoe through their supposed deracination from a garden in which he wishes to regain. This reminds me of what Carl Jung writes in The Structure and Dynamics of the Psyche. Every problem, therefore, brings the possibility of a widening of consciousness, but also the necessity of saying goodbye to childlike unconsciousness and trust in nature. This necessity is a psychic fact of such importance that it constitutes one of the most essential symbolic teachings of the Christian religion. It is the sacrifice of the merely natural man, of the unconscious, ingenuous being whose tragic career began with the eating of the apple in paradise. The biblical fall of man presents the dawn of consciousness as a curse, and as a matter of fact, it is in this light that we first look upon every problem that forces us to greater consciousness and separates us even further from the paradise of unconscious childhood. With the Coda twins, and specifically on Mickey's part, we see a second split or calamity in the onset of puberty. Being the same age, they are both aware of each other's burgeoning sexualities as they develop, perhaps more than Nanami might be of Toga's. As such, not only do the true meanings of the garden motif and the themes of time, memory, and permanence in mythology get firmly established in the first Sunlit Garden episodes, but also incest and adolescence. In the case of the Coda twins, they now separate even further due to the changes of their bodies which will bring about the development of secondary sexual characteristics. Even if they still resemble each other to a degree, they will no longer be those mirrored designs of old. Kozoe recklessly accelerates his sexuality in order to provoke Mickey into seeing who she is, but Mickey tries his best to remain in the candy land of childhood. This is why after Kozoe's interview appointment with Mikage, the two veer on the edge of incest more than before or after, because there, Kozoe was regressed into the recesses of Otori, the dreamlike land of Nostos over which Akio rules. Before I move on to the next portion of this segment, I do want to note that you can never discuss one Coda without the other, meaning that while in-universe they are split, our analysis rejoins them in a way neither one would ever be able to do or understand in their present conditions. Narratively, they are twin pieces of a larger architectonic and isomorphic story throughout which they are refracted and transformed. The main takeaway about how the Sunlit Garden mixes time, memory, and impermanence is the way time and memory here are mixed up with space and phantasmagoria. I'll save the topic of phantasmagoria for a later video, but for the purposes of this one, I'll just define it as a sequence of events unreal and bizarre in a dreamlike manner. The word Dios, or Dios, comes from Greek, much like Anthe's name, and simply means divine or noble, but refers specifically to Zeus, and later on it becomes a cognate for the Latin word Deus, meaning God. As I mentioned earlier, you could theorize that Dios became Accio after he committed incest to prolong Anthe's life to revolutionize the world. Either way, the fact this god still remains a prince means Accio's pursuit of power is also one of youth. Here, I'll quote Peter L. Thorslev in the chapter Incest as Romantic Symbol. The symbolic implications of parent-child incest are the most obvious and of course are not peculiar to the Romantic age, although they were then most intensely felt. The sense of the past as being parasitic upon the future, of fathers, authorities, institutions, and traditions having outlived their usefulness, but being unwilling to grow old gracefully and wither away, and even attempting grotesquely to renew their youth by devouring the young or by reproducing upon them. I think Otori Academy lacks a real sense of time and space so as to tie in with the dreamlike aspect of the series, which I call Phantasmagoria. This places Otori in some primeval position between dream and reality, mind and matter. In this space, memory and desire mix. Memory is mixed in as a way to visually represent melancholia in Freudian psychology. Essentially, Freudian melancholia is the fixation of a past loss to the point one's identity begins to center around that loss. In Miki's case, it's the Sunlit Garden. In Accio's case, it's being Prince Dios again. In all cases, it's a desire to return to an idyllic past that never existed, to the state of consciousness before one grows up. The word graduate has an older meaning of to change gradually, but everyone in the show wishes to regress in some way, and they are trapped within a school.
なぜこの仕事に携わったのですか？
純粋にビジネスです。すでに契約以上の仕事はこなしてると思いますがね。100人の優秀な少年たちが大鳥学園に集められ、これに従事している。彼らはこの研究目的が世界を革命する力だとか、永遠を手に入れるためのものだと噂している。永遠を手に入れようなんて、永久期間のからくりを作り出そうとするようなものだ。人はもっと謙虚に、神様の与えてくれるものに感謝してればいいんです。
The family is eternal because it is the starting point, and so the logical conclusion of the search for lost time is incest. However, there is no turning back. This fixation on the past can only lead to stagnation and destruction. That is why the Death Arcana in Tarot represents more than just corporeal death. It represents change in general, which is why a falling out can feel like a death. In the downright position, the Death Arcana represents holding on to the past. The deaths of the former self and of past bonds open the opportunities for new selves and bonds. We are meant to split from our familial bonds and form new ones, which would consequently mean that our former familial bonds will change and not be as important. However, Accio and Otori put a wrench in that to prevent maturation and graduation, but the pursuit of this primeval past would mean claiming incest, a moral exclusive to the gods and from which humans are barred. Within these confines of time and memory, people run about an empty movement. They involute upon themselves, their hearts and minds close off to change. Revolution from Involution. Here, I'll explain why I use the word involution. I haven't been able to use it as much throughout the main body of this essay as I had intended, but I think I can tie it all in here. In RGU, involution is, in my words, the process of reverting to an earlier, more primitive state so as to match a previous function. Shrinkage, regression, confusion, and overcomplication inevitably recur as a result. The world of Otori is a nexus of involuted dreams, memories, and desires that lies somewhere in a primeval corner of the world, or more accurately, between the real and unreal. I like to think of Anthe and Akio as being in the middle of the anima mundi in a way. While different campuses are mentioned and Tokiko later visits, Otori can be generally read as a hermit princedom. While they may not have made Otori, they are its governing bodies, hence Anthe's ability to read people's complexes. Prince Dios then symbolizes the pursuit of the past. The impossibility of the goal, however, renders it all moot. It's as sustainable as a perpetual motion machine, but everyone here is chasing a phantom of the past, which is why Akio, the man sexually abusing his little sister, is the acting chairman, the end of the world. But he's the end also in the sense he wishes to never grow past adolescence, which keeps him from opening the door he seeks to open. Because like Mickey, he's actually content with staying in that mythic garden and nest he long ago should have left, with constantly returning to it and creating self-serving myths. Basically in RGU, incest is a perpetual motion machine. The perpetual motion machine here is closely linked to heterosexuality. There is, after all, no queer incest in this show. While there are non-incestuous relationships, it's notable how the hetero relationships with the most focus are incestuous, specifically the student council, the ones closest to Akio, the end of the world. And it's notable that the one person who stands truly opposed to it, in spite of their own flaws and limitations, is one Utena Tenjo. Utena Tenjo is the femme-presenting person who instead dons a male uniform and proclaims to aspire to be a prince rather than a princess. While the show gradually lays out that the only way for a prince to exist is for princesses to be in danger, Utena's very existence and gender queerness stands in opposition to the main power structure of the world, and especially of Otori. The show's main message is to do away with these stringent gender norms, to do away with assigning this or that to male or female, personality traits, flaws, roles, even clothes. Like Oro Puppington and Darnie Darko, Utena's understanding only goes so far, but by trying to embody and or rebel against the roles around them, Utena demonstrates the absurdities of these supposedly eternal notions and roles that were, in fact, made after unequal relations came to be. Anthe was never a witch, but was instead assigned that and became it. And yet Akio's control of her is essential to holding up the structure of Otori. While the movie is a separate story, it so demonstrates how Anthe's subjugation to Akio is part of Otori in the Prince mythos. Utena as a genderqueer lesbian automatically goes against the status quo, even if they themselves don't quite know they're lesbian. I read Utena's pursuit of princehood as wanting agency, since that is the privilege granted to men in patriarchal society. I like to read the prince as ascribing a false consciousness into Anthe via compet, though I'm playing a bit fast and loose with my terminology. I'm obviously not a lesbian, but so much of Utena's character lines up with what I've heard of lesbians' journeys to self-discovery. Here, I'm going to briefly go outside the actual story and bring up some relevant points from the creators, which I haven't done a whole lot throughout this video. I asked my friend Zeal, the host of the Ikuhara server, why exactly Ikuhara uses lesbians so much in his shows. Admittedly, I asked it in a very awkward way, but they answered and later expanded on their answer in a Tumblr post. However, before I quote them, I want to quote the series planner Yuichiro Oguri. Evidently, Ikuhara had originally wanted to include two personalities in the main character, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't integrate them together into one character. So, he split them into two people, and the result was the birth of Anthe. In other words, the character Utena, as she was originally conceived, included the personalities of both the current Utena and Anthe. What makes Oguri's comment interesting is that Ikuhara says this in his commentary for episode 4. I decided to operate according to the rule, never give a character only one personality. I didn't want to reject fun on the grounds of I can't get this character to be uniformly consistent. Ikuhara has no problem showing sudden size of characters that might initially perplex you. I see this as him showing that people, and thus real characters, exist in multitudes. To go back to my friend Zeal, aka Horse Girl Anthe on Tumblr, they write in that post, titled The City and the Self, or The Uses of Lesbianism. When I initially gave my response to why Ikuhara writes a lot of lesbians, I cited the influence of shoujo manga. However, I didn't detail how homosexuality was featured in those manga. Ikuhara once said that the core theme of shoujo is self-revelation. He wanted to capture that in RGU, and it seems to have come across. Consider Takemiya Keiko's reading of RGU as A story about independence, about finding oneself. It feels like a story about a girl defining what is myself. This journey of self-discovery must involve encounter with the other. Part of romance is other longing, the desire to meet the unknown. Love requires a separate entity which is not merely an extension of the self. This is why I don't believe that Utena and Anthony actually are the same person. Through encountering the other, one can find one's own self, and further, through this encounter, the selves which meet can be transformed. While plenty of 20th century shoujo did center heterosexual couples, I believe that homosexual and homosocial relations were so prevalent because they facilitated this romance more effectively. On a visual level, a homosexual pairing can create a clearer parallel, as discussed above. For a more thematic angle, RGU's lead writer Enokito has mused that homosexuality removes the issue of genetic advantage from the equation. Since there is not a clear survival and reproduction benefit to homosexuality, it is easier to see it as pure love. Along the same lines, Ikahara has said that as soon as you see the destination point of producing children, sex becomes a social system. That's not to say that homosexual couples exist independently from social systems. The point is that writers who wish to pursue the idea of self-discovery through the other may wish to do so in the context where the norms of heterosexuality are not an issue, as they could muddy the water. Visually, Utena and Anthy are mirrored, such as in the opening where they spin facing each other, but to the writers they are literally mirror halves who were split from each other to form two distinct beings. Their mirrored union stands in contrast to the mirrored unity of incest. Again, note that in this series, all the incest we see is heterosexual and associated with the perpetuation of patriarchy, gender roles, and the continued existence of Otori itself. In opposition, we have a sapphic relationship that later results in Anthy leaving the order she was once a part of. While Utena may have duel with Akio, what makes Utena stand out in the finale is how they simply reach out to Anthy rather than take her as the game of the Rose Bride had mandated. Utena and Anthy embody a sameness that the incest and Otori can never match and seeks to destroy in order to control them. I've stressed the fact that Akio is only the acting chairman for a reason. In the movie, it's revealed Akio has long been dead. At the end of the movie, Utena and Anthy escape Otori into a desolate wasteland. However, Miki says the others will catch up eventually. In the RGU anime, only Anthy leaves Otori. As stated before, both Akio and Anthy seem to be centered at the functioning of Otori. In the movie, Anthy upkeeps the illusion of the prince. In the rest of Ikahara's works, characters make sacrifices to effect great change, but this change is limited because the problems tackled are bigger than what could be solved by mere individuals. The choices of these individuals still matter and the day is still saved, but only for a time and to a degree. And as such, I read Otori as a microcosm in the most literal sense. Akio and Anthy didn't create Otori like a lightener makes a dark world in Deltarune. Given the theme of fleeing and proceeding to a strange corner of the world, I think of it more as them settling in Otori. This fleeing again ties into the inability to move on from the past, but at least Utena and Anthy are able to be themselves. From their involution, they were able to have personal revolutions. I know I said I didn't like this book, and my quotation here goes against the book's intent, but I can't help but to want to end this segment on this line from Paradise Lost. Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. There's a lot I left out in this video. While I had 2 years of discussion and analysis before I began writing, I insulated myself from reading other people's analysis until I got the main body of this essay done. I did go looking for more analysis once I did, and thankfully did find others reaching my conclusions, which tells me I'm not insane or reading too much into things. I just wanted this analysis to be entirely mine. That way I'm not just quoting other people. But hopefully I managed to come off original and not too derivative. Either way, I leave much unsaid. My goal isn't to explain every interaction or theme, but to give a broad explanation of the theme so that y'all can understand on your own. As I mentioned at the introduction to this video, I mainly made this video for people who are fresh off watching RGU and who are looking for explanations and analysis. I was surprised to see a lack of a YouTube video dedicated to tackling the incest theme, although the aforementioned video on Mickey by Snake Eye Dreams gives great insight, but I wanted to make something that goes beyond Mickey. Of course, it makes sense why a video like this wasn't made already, cause who the hell sits around thinking about fictional incest? A lot of people, apparently. There's a lot about the show I still don't understand, and I'm sure I got some things wrong in this video. None of this is even to mention how interpretive this series is. I really struggle with understanding the relationship between Prince Dios and Akio in particular, along with the nature of Otori. All that said, I hope this video has been of value to y'all, and I hope even longtime fans have discovered something new with this video. Again, you'll at least get a video to link to normal friends about the anime's use of incest. This is my first video essay, so I hope everyone will be forgiving about my shortcomings. I've always been an analytical person, but I've never done a proper essay on my own like this before. Even as I write this, I have a hard time following what I wrote, and I have a harder time trying to correct it all in my head and on paper. Maybe some years down the line I'll make an addendum on stuff I miss in this video. Maybe I shouldn't worry about it so much given I chose a very difficult story to tackle for my first video essay, but still, I just hope this makes actual sense to y'all. I know I skipped out on the whole Phantasmagoria thing, but that'll be the subject for my next RGU video. I sure as fuck couldn't tell you when that might come out, but I can promise it'll be a hell of a lot shorter. Maybe like 15 minutes, 20 if I'm feeling frisky. I have a Coda after this, but it'll probably be a bit controversial. Before that though, I did end up finding J. Scott's website, which is a very thorough analysis of the anime by the looks of it. As at the writing of this video, I found his website literally yesterday. The bits I've read have impressed me, and I encourage everyone here to read his analysis. He's obviously way more well read than me, so you'll get a lot more out of his site than this video. I don't know religion and mythology like that, you know. I'm just a motherfucker in his early 20s from Florida. I can only do so much. Scott's analysis is one of those I said lined up with my conclusions. We even use the same word, Involution. But he has way more knowledge to work with. I'll link his website down below in the description. SFM cutting in again. I was originally going to link to J. Scott's website in the description down below, along with a playlist with the music I used in this video. But I might do it in the comments down below, along with the timestamps for the music, just in case you're looking for a particular track. And just as a bonus, I'm also gonna link to a little playlist I made just for Flowers in the Attic. And on top of that, I'm also going to link to the Substack upload of this script in case you just want to like pull out any quotes instead of going through like a fucking YouTube transcript or whatever this shit, you know. You'll be trying to look back into this or that. And also, I am gonna put a lot of like additional notes in that script where like I explain a lot of the references I make, because I'm sure some of you are looking at the titles and shit. You're thinking you're making some reference, but I don't know what the fuck you're referencing. So you know that'll be there for if you want to be a real nerd. Along with a couple of corrections. I do have a lot of regrets with this video, honestly. I'm not gonna get into them here. They're just gonna be in the notes in the Substack upload. They're nothing major. They don't really like affect the analysis, but yeah. And again, it's mainly gonna be if you're like a real fucking nerd. I got this one idea from a footnote that's like, I go through like the most unlikely combination of like stories ever, but like it makes complete sense. Trust me. Do also check out my AO3 account. I honestly don't write a whole lot now because I'm working on something major on my own time. But I do have some RGU poetry, and I like to think it's what J.A. Caesar sounds like to Japanese people. Like obviously we have the translations and everything, but like from what I can tell, that motherfucker is hard to translate. I just imagine he's like Peter Sinfield of King Crimson. You know what I mean? I might write more Utena poetry. I don't know. The sky castle illusory, the princess plundering authority, the blaze chaotic, the shadows erratic, the coffin knocketh as the shattered bell tolleth, 2 darkling eternities at our sides, by the cousin of sleep's tides, the inevitable the wretched shan't abide. And this is from Phantasmagoria Panorama Perpetuum. I was originally making this like a whole retelling of RGU in like an epic poem, but I don't actually know a goddamn thing about poetry yet. Hopefully in November I'll be able to go through Harold Bloom's compilation of poetry along with something else to make it not so fucking white. But me being a poet, not anytime soon. This is just chapter 1, Provenance. It's just the intro sequence retold. Bedecked with stars upon the stage, the curtain falls. The girl in shone thick shadow amidst the bare-treed plain stood. Askance she looked, to the prince in white atop a pale horse she called. With hatal regal bearing he saluted, for from her orbitals tears falled. He spake, Hilo thee of the long crown, wherefore doth thy face drown? Off his horse he soon was, and she beheld his aspect. Dressed in all white jutted a dusky lineament. A fairer and more righteous figure she had never before seen. At the knee he bent, and she felt as if within the throes of a dream. She spake, O dear prince, I feel the world hath forsaken me. Mine parents met themselves at the clearing, all is woe. What is a girl such as I meant to do? For I have been the one to write their epitaphs. I was capable of mere solemn epigraphs, authors unknown. And so the prince, with Atlantean shoulders in height, reached with his hands to the girl's face, and with his rose-petal lips he succored her tears to restore her grace. Thou art fairest and true, in spite of desolation thee will to write upon their tombs. Vouchsafe to I and thine self to safeguard thy nobility and strength, and to let no evil hinder thee. And his horse Rocinante neighed. From his pocket he procured a gift, and upon the distal of her index he set it. I bestow upon thee this ring, for one day it shall us rebring. The wind howled, leaves blew, and the prince had proceeded into the atramentous blue. The girl, who swore himself to mimic him, was left astonished, and henceforth dubbed the figure in resplendent white her Lacrimosa prince. And this is chapter 2, which I also did title Involution. Anyway, this poem is just the egg speech, but like as an epic poem, I guess. From its shell the chick must burst, for if left within it shall only die of thirst. About it whirls the world, and if left without, it shall die without being born. To the world we must bring the power of revolution, and thus in turn avoid an infernal involution. Burst forth from the shell of the egg, so that upon judgment day we shan't beg. Again, I did want to make this like a whole like retelling of the series, or like a couple elements from the manga, just like aesthetic things that I liked, and maybe like some of the elements in Mawaru Pinguljam, especially when it comes to family. Because if you ask me, RGU deals with family more so as an institution than a personal experience. I think Mawaru Pinguljam is the one that actually really deals with family as an experience, and that's probably why Ikuhara took so long to make it. Cause like Adolescence of Utena dropped 1999, Mawaru Pinguljam didn't drop until 2011. Which obviously suggests you have to do some kind of like soul searching or something like that. Coda, when the media has content in it. You know, I never once thought I'd think so much about incest. I had long planned to do video essays, but I never knew on what or how to start it, and I wanted whatever I wrote to be unique. I do like popular stuff, but they get talked about to death to the point I don't think I have much to add. The only exception might be Deltarune, but later we'll see about that. That being said, I didn't expect incest to be the main topic of my first video essay, nor did I expect for it to be so long. When I first started writing this script, I expected it to be 4K or 8K words, but it ended up being 8K. I really didn't think I'd have this much to say about it, but I kept thinking about what initially confused me so much about this anime when I first watched it in early 2023. I know I might have come off a bit antagonistic at the beginning, and it's because I grew tired of moralistic haranguing after a while, which is what led me to here. Back in 2020, I read a novel called My Dark Vanessa by Kate Elizabeth Russell. It's about a woman named Vanessa Y who struggles in coming to terms with the fact that she had been groomed by her English teacher. However, a different author by the name of Wendy C. Ortiz accused the novel of plagiarizing her memoir Excavation, along with her getting preferential treatment due to Russell being white. I actually agree with that second sentiment. You see that pernicious whiteness everywhere in society. However, Russell's novel hadn't even been published, and the accusation of plagiarism was centered around the novel's similarity for being a story about a student getting groomed, specifically with the teacher using the book Lolita to groom her. which isn't at all exclusive to anyone, sadly enough. Part of the accusation was the idea that Russell was appropriating Ortiz's experiences. I still have to read Excavation myself, but it seems that most people who have read both books don't see any evidence of plagiarism. This in spite of the fact that Russell will later go on to admit she actually had read the memoir as a reference and inspiration, which isn't art in the creative process. However, due to the public backlash, Russell will later make a statement on how she herself had been sexually abused and based the novel on her experiences with older men. So much for appropriating others' experiences. To add on top of this, I do remember seeing some people online say that the novel doesn't make a clear condemnation of grooming due to how Vanessa tries to downplay what happened to her. They found the inclusion of statutory rape scenes unnecessary or confusing for the book's message. To be quite frank, these people are fucking idiots. The book makes it so fucking clear Vanessa is still struggling to deprogram the grooming she underwent. Now, in light of Russell's statement about her experiences, it's even clearer what the book was already incredibly clear about. My Dark Vanessa isn't an abstract, experimental, and referential story like Revolutionary Girl Utena or Ada. Although, My Dark Vanessa did reference a certain book that I briefly mentioned, Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov. The references were numerous last I remember, such as the novel itself being dedicated to Dolores Hayes alongside Vanessa White herself. And Russell went beyond Lolita. She even references Pale Fire, last I remember, another Nabokov novel. And so I picked up Lolita as a personal homework assignment. I only knew Lolita by its reputation. I actually at first thought it was a 19th century Gothic novel, mostly because I had only seen Gothic Lolita fashion. But I had no idea what actually awaited me, or how it would change me as a person and lead me to where I am today. I had avoided even interacting with Lolita for obvious reasons. Why on God's earth would I ever want to interact with such a sordid little book? But what I encountered was one of the most unique and beautifully written books ever. The prose was such a shock to my system. I kept thinking, I never knew you could write like this, especially about something so awful. I was so enchanted by and enamored with this novel, and dizzied by how wrong the book's reputation had been, that I needed to find out more. So I ended up finding Jamie Lothis's Lolita podcast, which goes over the history and cultural legacy of the novel. Now, I'm not going to dive into this book here or my own gripes with modern discourse about it. I encourage anyone here with the will to read it themselves. But my point is that I found my favorite author, Vladimir Nabokov, and from him I learned a new way to approach fiction. Most importantly, I learned to just go down the rabbit hole, to eschew moralism and make my own opinions no matter what prevailing opinion might be. The My Dark Vanessa fiasco showed me how the moralistic crowd that complains about the ickiness and problematic media doesn't really understand fiction, and that there's no point in establishing credibility with a bunch of bumbling idiots. All this to say that because I went against this crowd and, speaking more generally, these sentiments, I ended up finding some amazing stories. Of course, no longer being that moralistic and simplistic took a long time. I had obviously seen incest in a lot of media before I took on this essay, but I never really thought about incest in fiction until I read Ada by Vladimir Nabokov, which I read due to it being his longest book. If there's anything you should know about me, it's that with books I am a size queen. I otherwise would never have read such a novel, but Nabokov had earned my trust. Here I'll quote Nabokov in his afterword to Lolita. The publisher's refusal to buy the book was based not on my treatment of the theme, but on the theme itself. Of course, despite having been a Nabokovian for a while and having Ada in my top 10 books, I was still very weirded out by the incest aspect of Revolutionary Girl Utena. I did end up understanding it, but as I stated at the beginning of this video, I found most people's explanations of RGU's handling of incest rather lacking. Something felt like it was missing, but I couldn't put my finger on what exactly. I especially didn't understand Miki and Kozue. I figured maybe that was sloppy writing, but I hope I've been able to illuminate and highlight the structure of this show, and have been able to make y'all appreciate it even more. Because all this project has done is make me fall in love with this show all over again. The videos and discussion posts online I had seen just left me with some questions. What did it actually mean for there to be incest in mythology? How does RGU actually explore that? Why is it that Ikuhara says he wants to avoid making something moralistic when the message of the show is a condemnation of patriarchy? Just why was there so much incest elsewhere in the show? I did gain a working understanding, but something just kept tugging at me. Ikuhara's talk about wanting something moralistic did line up with how Nabokov approached Lolita, so that at least pointed me in the right direction. However, I wouldn't have gotten here if I hadn't taken a plunge into Ikuhara's other works, starting with Mawaru Penguin Drum after my RGU rewatch last year. At first I had faith in Ikuhara, but Pinkerjum's use of incest disturbed me. I wondered, and it seems I wasn't the only one, if this was seriously the same director behind RGU. I thought RGU's use of incest led to a clear thesis, even if I felt the Coda twins muddled it a bit. Meanwhile, Pinkerjum felt very icky. Thankfully, when I finished watching my watch at Pinkerjum in very early November of 2024, I found Zeal's Tumblr post linking to their video essay on Pinkerjum, which provided much needed context. This was how I found the Ikuhara server, although I was still confused about the incest. A few watches later, alongside a lot of discussion with the members of the server, I formed a working understanding of RGU and Pinkerjum, even if the incest still weirded me out and I felt incredibly hesitant about recommending the shows to my friends in fear of being judged. However, in late December, I reread Ada. I finished it in the middle of January of this year, and it became my favorite book ever. After suffering literary withdrawal that made most other books pale by comparison for about a month, I found my footing outside my reading rut. Nabokov's bizarre masterpiece is incredibly referential, but one work stood out in how consistently it was referenced throughout all 600 pages, and I swear I had seen it elsewhere before. Les Enfants Terribles by Jean Cocteau. I decided to read it, and I was astonished by how strange it was, and I was surprised to see striking similarities across these 4 works. This was when I started seeing patterns in these stories about incest. After much thinking and discussion, I took a jump down another rabbit hole and looked for novels about incest. Forbidden by Tabitha Suzuma sounded interesting due to the Whitleys living in poverty, much like Paul and Elizabeth. I was surprised to see it was readily available at my library, so I went there and checked it out, feeling the clerk's eyes on me as I laid down the book, which had a rather embarrassing cover. I wanted to see if I could find the same patterns in a contemporary work dealing with the same theme of incest. By then I had formed a solid grasp on how Pinkerjum used incest, but I wanted to verify it by reading a book set in this century. I saw the same themes again. And so I decided to finally read Flowers in the Attic by V.C. Andrews, a book I had put off for so long, and once again I found the exact same patterns. All of these are amazing stories. Mawaru Pinkerjum is now my favorite anime, and I no longer see the incest as an aberration. Instead, I now see incest as integral to all these stories, and shockingly, I found these stories to be some of the most resonant, poignant, and beautiful I've ever come across. Flowers in the Attic in particular left me devastated when I finished it. When I finally understood Pinkerjum in March, I felt a swell of intense emotions, a recognition so overwhelming that I felt the anime had been made for me. I hadn't experienced such a shock since I read the Dark Tower series by Stephen King when I was 12 to 13, the book series that truly made me a reader and inspired me to become a writer. Some years down the line, I wanted to make a comprehensive analysis of Pinkerjum, but we'll see about that when the time comes. I think I'll just quote Percy Shelley here. Incest is, like many other incorrect things, a very poetical circumstance. It may be the excess of love or hate. It may be the defiance of everything for the sake of another, which clothes itself in the glory of the highest heroism. Okay, I'ma cut in again to add some context, cause that last quote sounds fucking wild out of context. Percy Shelley wrote that in a letter to a Mrs. Gisborne about a play called Los Cabellos de Absalón by Pedro Calderón de la Barca, which is based off the biblical story of King David and his children. I don't really know what it's about beyond that. Shelley just examines how incest is used in fiction, and I think he does it well. The actual quote goes on for a bit longer, as you can see, but I cut it short to just put in what's relevant for this video. Also, yeah, I know the original version of Frankenstein by Mary Shelley has cousin incest in it as well. I guess the Shelleys bonded over their appreciation of fictional incest. I haven't read either of them yet though, and my Spanish isn't good enough to read Calderón for now, so I can't, make any personal evaluations here. Actually, while I'm here, I do want to clear up as to why RGU has so much incest. I did explore it this way, but having the scriptwriter, Yoji Enokido, outright say it in his commentary for episode 4 makes it even clearer. I've often been asked why so many brother and sister relationships appear in this work. Well, it's mainly because it's a taboo sexual behavior. To expand on that explanation, I felt it would make it easier to understand the interpersonal relationship prior to the antagonism. The duelists are all adamant realists, but they all share one weakness. They have a part of them that cannot fully accept reality. Because of this weakness, they seek the power of Dios. For Kaoru Miki, the sunlit garden symbolizes his obsession with the past. And for episode 15, Enokido says, no, the Kaoru twins are alike in that they don't understand each other. I like Hasegawa's drawing of them on the jacket of the video / laserdisc. I like their pose with their left and right hands pressed together. They are twins, but they are also mirrored images of each other. I use the milkshakes as a symbol of relationships before the antagonism. It always seems to be just a little too sweet. This reminds me of a line from Wuthering Heights my friends sent me because of my ramblings about this project, and for which they provided me no fucking context. Though I do plan on reading it soon anyhow, so... And people hate their wives, sometimes, but not their sisters and brothers. And if you were the latter, you would live with us, and Papa would be as fond of you as he is of me. Ikuhara himself doesn't seem to have minded the fact Chiho Saito had made a forbidden romance incest manga either, given that Shiori's design was largely lifted from it, as his commentary for episode 7 reveals. There's also the Coda twins chapter in After the Revolution, which I seem to be in the minority in quite liking it, certainly more so than the rest of the manga. In general, I don't think RGU is some absolute rebellion against anime, as I had originally thought of it as, and as the Western fandom at large seems to believe it to be. RGU is very much an outgrowth of what came before. It's like Undertale in that regard. Toby Fox and Ikuhara wanted to take the stories in a different direction, not some deconstruction. I've honestly come to hate that term over the years. It seems to come from people who don't understand the dialectics of art, and especially not the genres which such works as Undertale and RGU come from. People just take the most surface level and moralistic approach, but the actual text at hand is so much deeper. But that doesn't win you internet brownie points, nor does it let you say, look, the media I'm into is way deeper than the other trash around it. I had a lot more for this part of the video, but I became incredibly dissatisfied with it over time. Eventually, I'll make a separate video about why I think we tell stories and what makes a work of art worthwhile. I'm just frustrated with how people want to make everything in fiction fit with reality. Fandoms in general just come up with completely different versions of the media they like in order to do this. That's why I hate the palace perspective essays, which seem to be the last previous attempt to tackle the incest aspect of RGU. I'd go on about a posh-lust travesty, but it doesn't deserve more than a brief mention in all honesty. But now I made something actually good, as opposed to that fucking pile of dog shit. The reason why I struggled with the incest aspect of RGU at first, and especially with my Water Penguin Drum, is because I was approaching it from a very moralistic standpoint that tried to make it fit into reality, rather than properly recognizing this as all fiction and engaging with it at an abstract level. And it's very understandable why I did that, but it's a very shallow way of thinking, and I don't think there's any excuse for shallowness. Some of the other RGU videos I came across just pussyfooted around the incest aspect, usually with this immature ring of giggles and snickers whenever the YouTuber brought it up. Snake Eye Dreams is the only one here who went deeper than that, but it wasn't enough for me. Over the years, I've come to mainly read non-fiction, which I think definitely contributed to my increasing frustration with how a lot of us try to make fiction adhere so closely to reality. I really do mean it when I say, just read non-fiction and watch documentaries. Anyhow, reading non-fiction has shown me some absolutely unbelievable shit, which made me realize I could do whatever the fuck I want in the world of fiction. Again, I want to get into all this in a later video, so if these notions of mine seem half-formed, it's because I still got a lot to read in order to really formulate it. This Coda was originally 30 minutes on its own, but again, I grew dissatisfied with it over time. But hey, that's what later videos are for. I'm just glad to have grown out of moralism. The split these two experience represents the birth of their respective consciousnesses. English is a stupid fucking language. This is so much easier in Spanish. Las conciencias. Like, it's so hard to say in English, but I hope y'all got the subs on, alright?